if you haven't seen it, I don't know what rock you've been living under. Jake Paul knocks out Ben Askren. It's a viral moment. Former MMA champion is slept by YouTube superstar in a boxing match. And it comes to question what is next for Jake Paul. He's called out high level names such as Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz. Does he get those big fights just yet? I don't believe so. But I believe after knocking out Ben Askren, there's legitimate fighter interest in beating this man. A lot of guys want their chance. You can see Ben Askren, the shot that put him down there. It was a straight right hand. Ben Askren went down. He did get back up. But I see why they did stop the fight. It's the Jake Paul show. He got a knockdown. He probably was going to knock out Ben anyways in that round. And that is it. Ben takes less damage. He makes a lot of money. He gets knocked out in the first round. But let's talk about what's next. We got a few names that we're going to mention. We're first going to start it off with, I would say, a name that has less possibility of happening, but there's going to be some backstory to it. Tyron Woodley. He was beefing with Jake Paul in the locker room. He was talking smack with Jalen Love. Tyron Woodley looks absolutely jacked in this old picture here. He's still excellent mixed martial artist, even though he's got some bad losses. He's also the training partner of Ben Askren. There's a ton of hype on this fight in the MMA community. The problem is, to the eye of the average fan, I don't necessarily think this sells nearly as much, so I believe Tyron Woodley does not get his shot, and he's not the next guy for Jake Paul. I wish he was. I think that he'd have a legit chance to knock Jake Paul out. He's a hell of a striker, but they're not going to pick a guy with a low upside and a high risk. He's a former UFC champion, and he's on a losing streak. Now, it comes to question, who is next? BJ Penn puts his name in the hat. He calls him out. The protege BJ Penn, who has lost 7 straight fights, has looked terrible, is only 5'9". Does this fight happen? There's definitely possibility that we actually would see this fight. Higher possibility than the Tyron Woodley fight. If this does happen, I fear that Ben Askren, or rather, BJ Penn will get Ben Askren. I feel like at this point in his career, BJ Penn losing in street fights, where I'm mixing him up with Ben Askren because both haven't looked great as of late, both coming off losses. It's just BJ Penn got dropped in a street fight. Granted, that doesn't matter. Supposedly he beat the guy up after. I don't care about that. But still, he's way past his prime. There's really no legitimate claim for this fight to be made besides that he's a former world champion. His last fight was at 155. Jake Paul's at 190. He's 5'9". Jake Paul 6'1". This is a terrible matchup, and it would give Jake Paul a legit knockout win over a former UFC champion. I feel like he'll destroy BJ Penn at this point. Penn way past his prime. Penn in his prime, maybe that's a different fight. He was a good striker, but at this point, at 42, that's a scary fight. I don't necessarily think this fight happens, but it is possible, and it would definitely stain the name of BJ Penn, but earn him a big paycheck. So I could see why he would be interested in it. And Jake Paul, I mean, there's nothing wrong with knocking out a former UFC champion. Does it happen? Less than likely. I'm saying this is not the most realistic option, but definitely more possible than the fight between Tyron Woodley and Jake Paul. Now, another name we're going to throw in the hat here is going to be somebody else who said they want it. The crippler Chris Lieben, who's had some success in bare knuckle, going 1-2 there, or actually, excuse me, not 1-2, 3-1 in bare knuckle. I'm mixing up his record. He's winning bare knuckle fights. He recently retired from combat sports, but I guess this wouldn't necessarily count. It'd be a boxing debut. He is 5'11". He is a natural middleweight. Chris Lieben actually poses a legitimate threat to Jake Paul. He has power punches. He takes a pretty good shot. Now, he's not an elite level boxer, and he probably doesn't have the technical boxing skills of Jake Paul, but he's a naturally big man and is actually somebody who could give him a fair shake. I feel like this fight definitely does sell. There would be bad blood. They may get into it, and Chris Lieben is a nasty fighter. Upside for Jake Paul beating Chris Lieben, I think, is actually less so than BJ Penn, but it's a much more legitimate fight, and if you're a hardcore MMA fan, you do know if he beat Chris Lieben, that would be a legit victory. Still, another fight that I think is less than likely. I feel like the 3 MMA fighters we've just talked about are very unlikely outcomes and probably not going to get the fight. But I'd be intrigued to see this matchup out of all the 3 we just talked about, probably the most. And I think it's most likely out of the 3, maybe with the BJ Penn and it being tit for tat. But the BJ Penn is a mismatch as far as size goes. At least the size matchup is more similar here, but for Chris Lieben and Jake Paul. But there's another name in MMA. This fight was supposed to happen already. It's Dylan Dennis. He's not a high-level MMA fighter by any means. He's a very high-level jiu-jitsu practitioner. He's a very good practitioner at jiu-jitsu. He's not been active. He's had some surgeries. His MMA career has been a lot more trash talk than actual fist fighting. He claims he can beat Ngannou in a fight, which to me just makes him seem stupid online. But Dillon Danis has a legit martial arts skill set. Does he have the skills to beat Jake Paul? No, I believe he'll be knocked out by Jake Paul. Maybe worse than Askren, because Dillon Danis cannot strike. Granted, he'll be in a lot better shape, so I do think he goes a bit longer than the aging Ben. I had to get a sip of this coffee here. I think Dillon Danis is an intriguing fight, and I think that's probably what is next. I'd say highly likely that we see Dillon Danis versus Jake Paul, and I do believe Jake Paul sleeps Dillon Danis. And if there's one guy out there that is similar as far as being disliked, MMA fans might be rooting for Jake Paul over Dillon Danis. I don't know if the jiu-jitsu community would even be behind Dillon Danis. He's just not a well-liked fighter. He trains at SPG, trains with Conor McGregor, but I still don't believe that's necessarily going to win him any fans. It does get Jake Paul closer to Conor. So I feel like that's why this is a realistic option. I would say this is very realistic. This is probably what is next. And I am intrigued to see what would happen between these two. And right off the bat, I'm going to tell you Jake Paul's knocking out Dillon Danis. And it's going to be another hype train booster. But now, there's somebody else who actually is more in the Jake Paul verse than the rest. He owns a win over Jake Paul's brother. We got to talk about KSI. He's not the tallest guy. He's 6 foot. He's a little bit shorter than Jake Paul, but he brings that 76-inch reach. He does train boxing at a legitimate level, has 2 boxing matches. The only other pro boxer that would be facing off against Jake Paul. Granted, he's not the most high-level pro boxer. He barely beat Logan Paul in a sloppy fight, but I feel like this is probably, besides the Dillon Danis fight, if he's trying to get that MMA name notoriety, this is a very realistic fight. I think KSI and him have a fun matchup. The beef would be real. He's avenging his brother Logan. I feel like this is a fight that sells massively on pay-per-view. If you're talking about pure money fights, this is the one to do. Dillon Danis may be next. KSI may be next. I think these are 2 legitimate options. Early prediction for this fight, I think Jake Paul beats KSI. I think stylistically he's a much more technical boxer, but KSI is a fun fight, and it's something that could happen, and he does own a win over his brother, so the storyline is already there. This is a fight that makes sense. Overall, we listed some names from most realistic to least realistic. To me, it goes Dillon Danis, KSI at the top of the list, and then I think you could see BJ Penn just go out there and get squashed by Jake Paul in that matchup, and then less likely options would be Chris Lieben, and with the least likely option, but definitely a scary fight, would be Tyron Woodley. But they're not going to give him Woodley. They're not going to risk Jake Paul taking on an aging MMA champion. Overall, Jake Paul gets another big win. He's 3-0 in pro boxing with 3 knockouts. He's selling himself very well. Also, the KSI backstory would be Jake Paul beat Deji, KSI's brother, and KSI beat Logan, Jake Paul's brother. I'm interested to see the beef between that fight, but as far as high-level competition, no, it's not going to be there. I do believe Jake Paul can probably take out KSI at this point. I think he also beats Dillon Danis. The tougher names are the less likely fighters, like Tyron Woodley, who probably won't get their fair shake. Even Robert Whittaker threw his name in the hat, but he's not going to fight Robert Whittaker. Whittaker is an elite level fighter. But overall, this was a fun little video talking about what I think is next for Jake Paul. I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure you guys smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel. Also, guys, follow my social media, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And I will see you all in the next video.